Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final session of day 4 of TMF Week 2025, and actually the final panel of TMF Week 2025. And today we're going to be talking about risk-based approach, which I'm sure is on the top of everybody's to-do list at the moment within trial master file management. Before we get started and before we introduce the panel, I'd just like to maybe just go over a few things. So some housekeeping. You guys have already heard this several times this week, but I'm going to say it again. All sessions are going to be recorded and will be available at the end of the conference. And you will receive a certificate of attendance for the entire TMF Week conference and not for each session. So look out for that, and obviously you can post it on LinkedIn and do all sorts of neat stuff with that certificate. Now this is a panel, so we do encourage you to ask questions throughout the panel as we're speaking. I think we want it to be very interactive, so there is a Q&A tab to the right of your screen where you can ask your questions. And we'll keep an eye on that, and obviously we'll try and bring those questions up as we go through different topics. And for this session, there will not be a network break at the end. So this is really the last session of the day. So with that, I am also going to make a small announcement. As you know, there was an opportunity to win not only a free pass to attend the CDISC Interchange Conference in Nashville in October, but also the opportunity to win a custom-made pair of Converse, which say certified TMFer, which is kind of neat. So they'll be made for you, for your size, etc. And so to find out if you've won either of those things, go to the last session of the day tomorrow, which is a trivia quiz, which is being hosted by Jamie Toth. It will be a lot of fun as well. So yes, go to that session and then you'll find out if you're one of the lucky winners for either of those prizes. So with that, I'd like to now pass things over to David Ives, who will be the person chairing this panel and facilitating the panel today. David, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Very excited to be here with these wonderful panelists. I think just in the way of introduction, maybe we'll go around, introduce ourselves. So I'm David Ives. I am currently at Novartis. I'm head of what we call clinical document management process. So maybe Brian, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, so thank you very much, David. Well, such a pleasure to be here. My name is Brian Souter. I am the Senior Director. I am the Head of Essential Document Management at Merck. And I've been with Merck & Company for 22 years. Spent a lot of my time as a CRA prior to getting into the TMF space, but been in the TMF space for about 15 years. Jackie?
Thanks, Brian. Really excited to be here and be a part of the panel. My name is Jackie Morrill. I'm a Director of TMF Management at Apogee Therapeutics. I joined Apogee in September of last year, but have been in the clinical research space my whole career. Started as a site coordinator at a few of the Boston area hospitals before moving into the TMF space just about 13 years ago now. I've been fully dedicated to the TMF. So really excited for the conversation today.
And so I'm Paul Fenson-Carter, CEO of Montreal, also very much involved in the reference model as the chair, and very passionate about risk-based approach and what opportunities it brings to the industry. So nice to be with you all. I feel I'm with old friends today.
Yes, it's a great group. Yeah, and I think so that thank you all for the introductions. And as Paul said, the focus of the conversation is going to be on risk, on calculated risks, and trying to help sort of define what that means. I think it's a very, top of mind conversation for a lot of us in the industry, is figuring out with, ICHE 6R3 in particular. I mean, for many of us prior to that, figuring out how do we actually deploy risk-based approaches. So maybe we can just start, and I'd like to hear from each of you. When you think about ICHE 6R3, obviously there's an emphasis on quality by design, taking risk-based approaches, trial management holistically. can you each describe what a calculated risk means to you in the TMF space? And I'm just going to totally randomly pick on Brian first. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I'm sure everybody's going to have very, very unique answers to this, no matter who you ask. And for me, what a calculated risk is differentiating what is critical from what is important, and being able to build processes and have oversight of the unique processes that are targeted those critical components versus what I call the important components. And for my company, we made a collective decision as to what is considered to be critical versus important. And we've implemented many measures to ensure that we have the proper oversight, the proper reporting and detectability, issue awareness and issue resolution for both what is important and critical, but the critical components has a higher level of rigor. And for me, that calculated risk is predefining what is most critical and developing your processes and oversight tools around it specifically.
Thanks, Brian. And I'm just curious, just a quick follow-on question. That you said we define sort of collectively. Can you kind of give us some insight into who was the we in your case?
Yeah, so big company. So the we are many, and it's an inclusion from our QA department, our quality control or quality assurance, quality control people, the business, the end users, the process owners, senior management. So it is a very collective group that identifies what is critical, and it's critical what is to be taking extra steps to ensure that we have completeness or the collection of a record. It can be the criticality of measurement of timeliness for certain processes that we have. So that critical component is broad, to say the least.
Yeah, that's great. Jackie, what do you think? Can we turn to you next?
Yeah, sure. So from my perspective, when I think about calculated risk, it ultimately for me kind of comes down to the whole idea of risk proportionality. So really making sure that we are being smart about where we're dedicating our time and effort. So we really want to ensure that that time and effort is proportionate to the level of risk associated with a particular activity. So I think our TMF processes, our resources should really be focused on kind of what are those highest areas of risk. So there may be differences in kind of the level of scrutiny that we apply to certain record types, to like Brian's point. Like there are certain things in the clinical trial space that are ultimately more critical to get right and others that are just important. So making sure that we're focusing time, effort, and resources in the right areas to make sure that we're really kind of meeting the mark in those most critical and highest impact activities.
Yeah, that's great. And I like, that element of sort of the resource consideration, right? Because all this has resource consideration. And maybe, Paul, I can give you a little bit extra homework in answering this question as well, because you see and have conversations with, sponsors, CROs, people across the spectrum of size, progression of maturity, company-wise, et cetera. So maybe, you can answer what this sort of calculated risk means to you, but also I'd be curious to see if you see certain segments or smaller companies more willing to take risks, bigger companies, if you can add any sort of element from your perspective from the vendor side, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, for me, the concept of calculated risk, as Brian and Jackie said, it's all about proportionality. So the evaluating the risk proportionality in relation to patient safety, data quality, the classic things that we've always looked at within risk-based approach. But I also think it's about doing more with less as well. So one thing that Torsten Stemler said last month in Geneva at the CDIS conference was their expectation by taking a risk-based and proportional approach is that we actually produce less documentation rather than more, or less records rather than more. Sorry, I have to be careful. I shouldn't use the word document anymore. But and that for me initially, I was almost shocked, but at the same time, then I started to think about it, and I was sort of thinking about what things were like in like the early 2000s in the data management world, where we used to collect like tons and tons of data that we didn't really use for any particular purpose, but we always just collected it because we always did, and like that's what you had to do, you know. And I think it was because the idea was, well, at least we're covering ourselves, you know, in case we need it. But the problem is that data quality suffered because we just had too much of it. It just became a burden. And I think that calculated risk is also about reducing the burden of collecting records and collecting information that may not really have any impact at all on your ability to be able to tell a story of what happened in the study and demonstrate, you know, the integrity of your study. So I think it's also about that. It's about reducing the burden and allowing us to really focus on what we should be focusing on, and therefore hopefully improving the quality and completeness of the information that really is important or critical to the study. Now, in terms of approaches, I've had many discussions with many, as you said, David, with many different sizes and types of organizations. And I think that right now what I'm seeing is a lot of organizations are kind of struggling with the fact that there are so many different factors that feed into risk assessments. And, you know, we can look at the risk of our TMF management process, which is really where the CDISC TMF risk framework has gone so far. You know, they've been looking at the TMF management process. But I think we also need to be looking at the risk that the study itself represents. So the study design, you know, what are the aspects of the study which will have an impact on what we should be focusing on from a record standpoint. So that I think is also really key. And I think that some of the larger organizations are really starting to go in that direction, which is great. And I think some of the larger organizations as well, and this came up yesterday in another discussion, are starting to put in place kind of risk management teams that are kind of transversal, and they're going across you know, all of the clinical teams and providing like kind of one central place where we can start to look at study risk. And it's not just specific to TMF, but TMF should be looking at study risk. They really should, you know. I think with the smaller groups, obviously the volumes are much smaller, and typically they're able to be a little bit more agile. But I think one of the things that they also are challenged with is a lack of tools. And today there's a lack of tools available to us, even within our eTMF systems. And so risk-based approach today tends to be quite manual, right? And we have trackers and we have Excel spreadsheets, things like that we use to kind of work out what we should be doing. But I think that the smaller guys are definitely much, you know, they're very interested in applying this. And obviously as an industry, we have to apply it across the board. It doesn't matter how big or small you are. We should be taking a risk-based approach. And so I think that there's definitely an appetite, because I think you know, people realize the benefits of being able to be focused. But obviously there are still a lot of organizations out there who are unsure about what's the best path. And there's also a risk to taking a risk-based approach, right? Because if you don't do it properly, then what's going to happen next time you're inspected, right? And if you're a small company, maybe you don't have that much inspection experience, and so it can be quite challenging to take that step. I'm going to stop talking there because I could go on for hours. But,
Clearly,
that's what I think.
Yeah, and that's great. And I think what's interesting is, you know, when you're talking a little bit about sort of risk in context of other risks, right? Like the TMF as a risk should not, I think, be seen as its own separate thing, right? And so, you know, you think about at one point, many companies were focused on risk-based monitoring, right? And then that sort of morphed into risk-based quality management. And like, there's still plenty of organizations figuring out what does that look like. And I think to your point, Paul, it's bringing the right people, and Brian was talking about this as well, is like bringing the right people through some sort of agreed framework that this is how we're going to accept, and these are our thresholds, and these are what we're going to watch. and trying, not to watch it all. So I think it's a good point you just made about it should be happening in context, right? So
can I just add something to that,
yeah.
David? So you're talking about risk-based monitoring. So obviously risk-based monitoring is about detecting issues mainly at clinical sites. And there are different approaches to it, but quite often you're trying to detect like outliers and like patterns that just don't make sense. But I think the results of that analysis that goes on in risk-based monitoring is also very important to TMF. Because if you have a site that has potential issues because it's been detected in risk-based monitoring, we should also be adjusting our risk-based approach in TMF to maybe put a little bit more focus on that particular clinical site, because maybe if there are issues at that site, there may also be issues with the records that we have for that site. Do you see what I mean? So I think that's where TMF touches so many different areas that we should be kind of interconnecting with all of these different risk frameworks that right now are kind of segregated, but really should become more of a one risk framework for clinical trials.
Yeah, and Paul, just to add to that, within our organization, we have a role within my group that in essence are the risk-based monitors, right? So they are TMF monitors, and they're associated and assigned to individual protocols. So they can do trend analysis to see what's going on for a given study. But we can further break that down and look at globally, are there certain risks or areas of focus due to metrics that we need to target by a particular country? Looking across all of the protocols that are being conducted within a given country, if the country's metrics are not up to what the other metrics for the other countries are. So I think that's kind of the approach that we take with the risk-based monitoring. It's not from the traditional CRA site monitoring, but it's the monitoring of the countries and the studies from a TMF perspective.
That's really neat. I like that approach. Like, I think that's important. So that's one of the important factors, right? It's not just about one study, it's about what's going on across your clinical program. And are there particular areas or processes or countries or even historically sites that may be higher risk than others? Okay. I can see that Jack is interesting to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's been one of the challenges with the whole idea of a risk-based approach, is that it's not uniform across all of our studies. So I think this really introduces a level of critical thinking and stakeholder engagement to make sure that we have the right players coming to the table to have some of these discussions and to truly do a risk assessment on each of our individual trials, to take into consideration things like trends, issues, because I think that's been one of the challenges. The smaller company, we may not have people with as much TMF experience, inspection experience. People really want that kind of cut and dry, tell me exactly what I need to look like when we're taking a risk-based approach for our TMF QC reviews. And it's it's really not that easy. We really need to, I think as a TMF community, we really kind of need to champion those conversations and kind of facilitate, get people thinking in that way about how do we effectively assess risk and kind of decide where we do focus our efforts when it comes to assessing quality, assessing completeness, things like that.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think so. I think this bridges nicely to. There's a couple questions that are kind of hitting at. Usman's asking about ensuring that you're applying risk-based principles doesn't lead to under-documentation or gaps in compliance, and that's sort of echoed in Ronla's comment about, when you're moving to collecting less documents, you need to get strategic about what you're looking for. But maybe we can just talk a little bit about the why, right? So I think, Paul, you said it's sort of this collect everything. And I think there's, at least for some organizations, perhaps a hesitancy to move away from collecting everything, unless, to your point, Jackie, you have this is exactly what we need to collect team, right? It'd be very prescriptive. So from your perspectives, and maybe we'll start with you, Jackie, is what's the most compelling argument to actually embrace a risk-based strategy? What's driving you guys to want to do that?
Yeah, so I think that whole idea of kind of collect everything mentality, and to Paul's point about generating all this data and filing it just because we've generated it, not really, again, thinking critically about what do we actually need to really tell that story of this trial in the most kind of efficient, effective, streamlined manner. We don't need all of that kind of extra documentation and fluff that kind of muddies the waters in some ways. So I think the most compelling argument when I'm talking to stakeholders is just really driving that point home that everything that we're collecting and that we're filing and that's going into the TMF, we have to be able to speak to that content, potentially even defend it in cases of audit or inspection. And that is ultimately going to fall on the shoulders of our functional area representatives and the people sitting on the study teams, the ones that are generating this content and submitting it to the TMF. So it really does benefit you in the long run to really take that moment, kind of look at the content that you're generating, really do that assessment of, is this adding value? Is this helping to tell the story, reconduct our trial conduct, support our data integrity, show that we've complied with our protocols, GCP regulations, where that may be? And if the answer is yes, then certainly file it. But if not, maybe take a step back and really ask whether that's necessary.
Yeah, I think that's, yeah, go ahead.
No, I think it's a really interesting point, because I think that there's taking a risk-based approach before you even start the conduct of your study, by kind of working out, okay, what do I truly need for this particular protocol in terms of information to be able to tell an accurate story. So that's kind of upstream, and then there's applying risk as the study goes on. And that's not necessarily about what information do I collect, although it could be adjusted over time. But it's more about, where do I focus my oversight efforts? And so it kind of, I suppose it demonstrates that there are different facets of risk-based approach and different ways of applying it at different stages in our overall TMF management process. So I think that's also something that we kind of need to think about. And that's when, when the risk subgroup of CDISC came out with the initial framework, I think the work that they did was very good, but for me, it's only one facet. Like there are other facets that need to be covered. And I'm not trying to take away from them, because I think they worked really hard on it. But it's just one of many facets, in fact, that we need to be thinking about.
Yeah. And Brian, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about sort of your why to embrace this risk-based strategy. But there's also an interesting question that Allison just posed. I'm curious if people can think of this while Brian's talking about his why. But there's oh, beautiful. We've pulled it up. So we think of an example of a type of record that's historically filed that's not critical today. But yeah, Brian, maybe you can talk about sort of your motivations, and then we can see if we can answer this.
So my motivation for the processes that I have responsibility for, or directed toward the inspection, to be able to have the trial master file speak for itself, so that nobody needs to provide additional explanation, that it speaks for itself. The concept, and going back to what Paul's initial statement was, that it is risky to be risk-based. And sometimes little things do matter. So the concept of collecting less is kind of very foreign to me and not accepted yet. So I come from the old school, where our focus has been more on controlling the content. Instead of filing every time that an event occurs within, say, I'm just using this as a general example, the IRT, a site's been activated, deactivated, shipment records, it's all important information, it's needed. So rather than file the individual documentation from each one of those events that occurred within IRT, we have an end of study report that provides all of that information. So the information is still collected, but we try to streamline where that content is and how it's collected, so that we're not creating volumes and volumes of records that one record can tell the entire story. So I think that for me is one of the big things, is more of content control. Business process is complicated, and again, from that risk-based approach, for me, it's not collecting less, it's ensuring that what is critical to be collected. And when I say what is critical, what we've defined are from inspection experiences, from known requirements within the BIMO from FDA inspection. So there are obvious resources that you can go to know that, okay, you always have to have this. And the criticality of review is focused on those sort of things. But that concept of, oh, you probably don't even need to collect that, that's still somewhat foreign to me, to be honest. The little things do, the little things do matter during an inspection for sure.
Interesting, yeah. So I appreciate that. I think, I'm curious. I've just one or two things jump to my mind. But Jackie, any thoughts on Allison's question? Do you have any examples of things that you say, oh, yeah, we used to kind of file these pretty standardly, but we don't view it as critical today?
So one area that came to mind, and this may be a bit controversial, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. So the whole piece of this is opening a can of worms, just around relevant communications and email filing. I feel like over time we've tried to, at least in organizations I've been a part of, move away from filing kind of the cumulative summation of someone's inbox and have tried to get more strategic ways of capturing decisions and things that may have previously been captured via email exchanges back and forth, and leveraging things like decision logs or like very structured meeting minutes, things like that, to really make sure that those critical decisions, study determinations are captured in kind of a more formalized way so that we don't have to rely or file as much of our email communications back and forth.
Yeah, and I just have to say, Jackie, I love that, because I will just, past life experience, somebody filed an email, thought it was a good thing to do. Inspector found the email and they said, great, show me where you told the rest of the study team that this was an issue.
Yeah.
And they couldn't find it, right? So now you've just opened up this can of like, you found an issue, you emailed somebody, but now how did you disseminate? What did you do about it? How did you mitigate the risk, etc.? So I really enjoy that. So I don't know, Paul or Brian, any things that jump to you?
I mean, I have one in mind where it's kind of, we see redundancy. So in the monitoring area, we have so obviously we have monitoring visit reports, which document exactly what happened. When did the monitoring visit happen? Who was the monitor? Who was on site? What was the scope? All of that stuff is in the monitoring visit report. But we also continue to file confirmation letters that we send to the site prior to the monitoring visit. Is that really necessary? I mean, we can see that the monitoring visit occurred because you've got the report. Do we really need that letter? So I think that's, it's just clutter for no reason. That's just one thing that came to mind. And I think there are many examples like that actually within, for example, the reference model.
Yeah, that's a good one. Brian, anything you wanted to add?
Nothing really that I can think of, but it is such an interesting concept of collecting less. And it's, for me, again, to reiterate what I previously said, it's if the information is outlined or defined within the reference model, it needs to be collected. But I think the trick is kind of how you manage that information. That's where the collecting less comes from, similar to what Jackie said. Have it in an organized structure and not have it like piecemeal from all these various different sources. Consolidate it. File that record.
Yeah. So again, it's this, I think, a bit of the sort of the context of that information, right? Like, how is that influencing or influenced by the rest of, the content that you're collecting? So yeah, that's really good. Yeah, one just to share from my perspective, another one that jumped to my mind. I had a conversation about this recently. Is like site stamped versions of the IB. It's like, what do we really need that? I mean, there's a whole host of reasons why we could say, we know that they have that. But anyway, so I think maybe we can just talk about implementing risk-based approaches, right? So we talked a little bit about the why and sort of what that means. And, you all sort of hit on this a little bit, but maybe we can dive a little bit more into where you've deployed risk-based approaches. So have you done it for a particular process subset? Document collection, QC, quality reviews, oversight of partners, or maybe across all of them. So, Jackie, would you mind if we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So I think where a lot of people tend to go to when you start thinking about risk-based applications and the TMF space, the first thing that comes to mind is QC. So our organization, we do leverage TMF bots to do some of our classifications, and that takes some of the burden off of the TMF team. We're moving away from doing 100% completeness QC reviews, really trying to keep those reviews more focused just kind of on like overall completeness, identifying gaps, have done a more detailed assessment of kind of how we're assessing completeness, looking at what are our milestones, what document types are associated with those, making sure that that kind of aligns and makes sense, and that by doing so, we are addressing and reviewing kind of those highest risk documents and the highest risk areas without doing, again, that kind of 100% QC review. So that's kind of been the focus so far. And like I said, I think that's where a lot of people go when we start talking about risk-based approaches in the TMF space. One thing that I would challenge people, and I think we're slowly getting there, is to think about kind of risk more broadly in the TMF space and look at kind of not just our activities like QC, but also look at like our overarching TMF management processes. Like I said, I think making sure that we have like robust processes that aren't overly complex, that we're not confusing our stakeholders when it comes to the expectations and responsibilities that they have in completing TMF QC reviews, making sure that everyone's trained appropriately. Like I think those are other areas of risk that, like I said, we're also trying to address by overhauling our whole suite of TMF process documents. But I think I don't necessarily like immediately think of that as like a risk-based kind of activity or approach, but really I think it should be. We should be looking at this risk from like that holistic kind of people, process, and technology. So that's where we've.
Jackie, I think that's a great call out, right? The risk to non-compliance of the process is as great of a risk as not having the document in the system. So I think that's a great call out. And I think from an example from what we do, and I spoke about kind of that predefining what are critical elements versus just important elements, and TMF completeness. So certain types of documents are deemed to be more critical than others. And we've developed a process called an essential record review process, in which the content owners, whether it's a CRA or somebody, we have country operation managers for country level documents and study managers for study level documents. So whoever that content owner is, not only do they have to ensure that the content's there and manage our system tools, the expected document list, but we require that they perform attestations on a continuous basis throughout the study for those predefined types of documents that have this higher level of rigor. And so what we found is by putting your name on something saying, I did this, and by virtue of me saying I did this, means that I have compared the trial master file to whatever the source is, if it's the investigator site file or something else, that in fact, at this point in time, we have what we need. The source system and the trial master file, if it's not the source system, are aligned and are in sync. So that would be one of the examples that I would use. And we don't do that for all documents. It's a kind of a limited set of what we define as being critical for review.
I love that accountability piece too, because I think that, as we've kind of touched on before, I think it's so important to, when you are looking to move to this risk-based approach, like you need that stakeholder engagement. We can't do this in TMF alone. We just don't have all of that context about what's going on in the day-to-day and all of the studies, like the documentation inside and out and kind of what some of the expectations are, but we really do need to get our functional areas engaged and involved in these discussions and kind of understanding their responsibilities and really kind of empower them that like they are the ones that are the SMEs that have this knowledge that can provide the appropriate guidance on where we should be focusing when it comes to risk. What are the blind spots that maybe we as a TMF team don't have necessarily visibility into? We're not sitting on the study teams day in and day out and involved in all of those communications. And I love tying it back to having someone on the study team being accountable and kind of signing that attestation saying like, yes, I confirm that I've done this review, that everything looks good. And also just that accountability too. I think if issues are identified as part of any of this, making sure that people are accountable for addressing those issues and concerns in a timely manner. If we have stumbled upon an area that maybe isn't complete, where we found gaps or quality issues, that it's very clear kind of who has that responsibility to make sure that those issues are resolved and that everything kind of gets back to that steady state.
So David, tell us what's your secret?
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's such an interesting, you use the word blind spot. And I think it's probably fair to say for a lot of organizations, we focus what's in the primary TMF, right? And Brian, you're just talking about this attestation. But actually, there is a big blind spot with these other systems, because I'm going to say a typical organization, probably lots of people have figured this out in wonderful ways, but we don't have a lot of insight, nor are we subject matter experts in some of those systems. So even if we had deep knowledge, you wouldn't be able to discern whether or not everything is there. So you really do need to rely on that subject matter expertise and leverage the collective, right? To make sure that you're saying, okay, collectively, and I think that speaks to what you're saying, Jackie, is around like education. Like as much as we've been saying it, I think the within this conference, within this room here, we sort of feel like we've been saying this for years. Like TMF is all of us, guys. It's not just like this final, right?
TMF is a team sport.
Yeah, I still feel like there's plenty of people that don't view it that way, right? Yeah. So I don't know, Paul. What would you like to add to that?
So I mean, you were talking about approaches. I mean, we've been sort of working with several of our sponsors on approaches more around sort of oversight. So how do you apply a risk-based approach to oversight? And we've taken more of almost like an analytical approach, where we've looked at different factors. So first of all, we've looked at the list of the index, the list of record types that we have, and we've tried to assign sort of a risk categorization, sort of like critical, important or low, to each of those record types. And obviously that can vary from study to study, but you can sort of, as an organization, already come up with a master list. And people have been doing that kind of approach, I think, for a while, where they've gone through and they've classified all of their indexes with a particular risk level. And then we've also looked at metrics. So we've looked at quality metrics. So what's the query rate? How many queries are we getting? What kind of queries are we getting? And then timeliness. Are we seeing a lot of timeliness issues? Because obviously timeliness can cause quality issues as well. And then finally, we're sort of bringing in the study risk as well. And we're combining all of those factors together, and we're applying that to different dimensions. So the study, countries, sites, process areas, to come up with a score. And then that score is sort of is used within our TMF plan or within our oversight plan to say, okay, well, if you have a particular site that has a risk score which is above this amount, where you need to be focusing oversight efforts on this, this basis, every 2 months, every 3 months, or whatever. So it allows us to sort of come up with a very structured way to define how do we take a risk-based approach to oversight, and then afterwards, obviously, as we do that oversight, we can start to make adjustments to the scoring, because we also apply weighting in there as well. And so it's quite a comprehensive way to do it, but it does sort of take into account all of the different aspects. So study risk, the operations, so the metrics, and then just the classification based on kind of processes and groups of records. And I think that's something that is very doable, and it would be nice to sort of start to see some tools out there that start to sort of take those kinds of approaches, because all of the data is contained within your TMF system. So why not use that data to drive your oversight processes?
Yeah, and I think you made a really interesting point in there, Paul, too, just talking about how that number and score can change over time. Like, I think that's one thing when we talk about taking a risk-based approach is that it's not static. Like this may kind of evolve and change over the course of a study. So we can't say that at the start of the study, maybe X, Y, and Z, these were our risks or areas of concern, but we have to make sure that we're continuing to monitor over time, because if certain study events occur or things shift and change on the study, we need to make sure that we're responding in kind as those things happen and kind of keeping up to date. So I think that's the other thing, is that this is very dynamic, that it's not something that you can kind of define at the start and just to follow one kind of approach throughout. Like it needs to be something that can kind of shift and evolve as the study evolves and things happen.
Yeah, and I think that as we start to sort of move much more towards a process-based approach to TMF in general, and I think that that's going to happen where we start to look at activities that are occurring in the study and processes that are running in the study, and sort of grouping our records around those processes. We can also start to do risk scoring on processes. So if we start to detect, well, there's a bunch of SAEs that have occurred at this particular site, it's around the safety process. So you're going to start to maybe dig into that and make sure that we've been covering what we need to cover in terms of that safety process, and that we have all of the relevant documentation, that we're going to be in a good place if the inspector starts to dig into that, because obviously it will be a trigger for the inspector if there's a significant number of safety cases. So I think that's really for me, that's the future, is when we start to think about things more in terms of study activities and study events and study processes, that we can really start to leverage a comprehensive risk-based approach. And also, it's not just for TMF, it's also for all of the functional areas that are running and managing these processes. They can also look at that information. It's useful for them too.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. Is like the utility of this information, the impact of this information, the approach overall, and that it is truly dynamic. But it leads to the question around how are you guys documenting this? Like, Paul, you talked about some of the sort of tools and approaches you're taking. Are you building these or advising, people you work with to build this into your SOPs? Are you doing it in the TMF plan? Are you doing it in a separate oversight plan? I'm just curious if we can dig into that a little bit. It's like
all of the above.
Where do we cap all of the above?
So I think that what we're advising is, obviously it's important to, within your SOPs, that you're talking about the fact that you're taking a risk-based approach. But what we typically advise is actually putting in place a risk management plan or appendix, which can be attached to the TMF plan. And because in reality, within your TMF plan, you're describing all of the processes that you're going to be following to ensure that your TMF is inspection ready, right? That it's complete, that it's of sufficient quality, etc. And so there's a very strong connection between that and your risk-based approach, because it's your risk-based approach which is going to drive those activities. So that's why we feel it makes most sense to be either an appendix of the TMF plan or part and parcel of the TMF plan.
And yeah, we've taken a similar approach to in control documents, SOPs, work instructions, stating that we are taking a risk-based approach, but then allowing for that flexibility by building in kind of the study-specific approach to risk management within the TMF plan. Since we really know, like I said, that it can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. So you do, I think, need a study-specific place to capture kind of what is actually being done on a study-by-study basis.
So we are a one-size-fits-all sort of organization when it comes to the processes and controls that we have. We found that it doesn't matter if it's an oncology study or infectious disease study. As it pertains to the management of the trial master file, it's all overseen the same way. And what I would say is, our process documentation obviously speaks to timeliness, completeness, and quality. We do indicate that it is a risk-based, we have a risk-based approach, but we certainly don't go into the details in any of our process documentation as to what is considered to be critical and what the threshold and targets are for certain metrics. But the business as a whole is made aware. We have reports on a monthly basis, various different scorecards that are sent to senior management and country operations and study managers. But as it pertains to, like SOPs, work instructions in the TMF plan, and that sort of thing, the why or the criteria for definition of critical is not stated in there.
So I'm curious, Brian, and this is sort of a sidestep, but I'm gonna do it anyway. You know, you talked about being a one size sort of fit for your trials. Do you guys have separate TMF plans at this point, or do you just operate off your procedures? Because I was talking with somebody recently and they said, we don't even do TMF plans anymore. It's all run off our procedures. I thought it was actually a fascinating concept, but
yeah, our TMF plans are probably much more simple than others. We absolutely utilize TMF plan. And I think the greatest value of the TMF plan for us comes into the identification of certain things, who is responsible for various different activities for that particular study. It's connecting the who to the what, providing guidances or information on the partners that we're using, the individual, vendors, partners that we use. But as it pertains to the processes for management of the trial master file, we simply refer back to our SOP, because that SOP covers all of our studies regardless.
Yeah, that's great. So I know, just sort of looking at the clock, we've got a few questions, but one thing that I wanted to at least try to get to is, like, we've talked a little bit about defining the risks and a little bit about, implementing in which places and how we sort of document that. But I wanted to just specifically hear from you guys in terms of, like, from a system perspective, are your systems helping actually facilitate that risk-based approach, or are you largely doing it sort of outside? And I know we've touched a little bit about it, but I just want to hear from you guys is, how much is the system impacting your ability to actually take a risk-based approach? Have you done custom, maybe configuration, customization, those kinds of things within your expectations? So I don't know, Brian, I see you're nodding your head. Do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, thanks. And with the intent of easing the burden on the business to understand what is critical and what the expectations are for targets and thresholds, we've created a lot of various different dashboards. We've configured the system to hard code documents that require certain reviews. We provide metrics on the compliance to the processes, whether it's our timeliness process or completeness process with the attestation. So we're very heavy into metrics and set up the system so it makes it very easy for the end users to know what is expected of them in this approach.
Yeah, and I would say that we are taking a similar approach, probably not as customized, but we definitely leverage things like reports and dashboards in the system to take a kind of real-time monitoring of quality, completeness, timeliness. I mentioned earlier that we are leveraging certain tools available, like using TMF bots to help take some of the burden away from classifying certain document types, other tools like duplicate detection, things like that, so that when our record owners are uploading content, it'll kind of automatically trigger them if it thinks something that's come into the system is a duplicate. And then also, as I talked to you a little bit earlier as well, looking at our expected document list and correlating that to milestones, making sure that the relationships make sense, that we're have the appropriate records associated with the appropriate milestones, that we're kind of capturing all of those most critical records through the milestones and kind of tracking against completeness, things like that.
I think so. Obviously, I'm on the system side, and honestly, I would say that I think we could do a lot more from a systems.
I would agree.
Right, and I think definitely we should be looking at things like AI, of course, but also looking at how do we sort of take what you guys are doing with your dashboards and then sort of transform that into actionable oversight processes and risk management processes within the system. And then even things like, when I first started my career, I started off in IRT and randomization and drug supply management and all that stuff. So I got into randomization a lot. And the good thing about randomization is it's there to remove bias, right? And I think the problem with oversight is there can be bias in oversight. And so I think that even having things like randomization involved could be very useful. So we can focus our our efforts onto specific areas based on the risk profile, but we could also randomize records within those areas to actually perform oversight. So we're not just sort of going in with a certain bias and selecting records, we're having the system select records for us that we maybe need to look at. So combining these different sort of methodologies, I think, could be really, really interesting and really useful, and maybe allow us to see things that we wouldn't have seen if we'd have just relied on our experience, kind of thing. Yeah. So I think there's definitely a need for a much better tool set, and I'm pretty sure that tool set is now that we've got sort of ICH E6R3 and pretty much everybody is now focusing on risk-based approach. That tool set will be forthcoming.
And I would also throw up. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to quickly pick up on something that Paul says, like, there's this element of the tools that we have available today and underutilization potentially of the tools that we even have available today, right? And I'm going to connect this to one of the questions, and I want to try to get to a couple of these. Ferdinand's asking about thoughts on content and living documents, running logs that are finalized potentially and uploaded at the end of the study. So visit logs, DOAs. I can think of a couple other things that might fall into this bucket. So to me, I'll just start by saying, I think, most modern TMFs these days can accommodate this as a support of your business process, but people don't do it. They're not using it in that capacity. So I'm just curious, maybe Paul, maybe you could start from the, as you say, you're on the vendor side. Like, how do you guys view that? What do you think? Are we underutilizing our current technology?
Yeah. I think that logs, first of all, I think contain a lot of really useful information that could be useful for risk profiling. Because the information within those logs is actually quite structured compared to, say, documents. What I see happening today is obviously a lot of companies are uploading their trackers and then they're versioning them over time, but it gets a bit messy, right? Because the trackers are being updated all the time, so there's a lot of different versions. And then there's also, the concept of final record. So when does this become a final record? Is it a final record when we first create it, or if it is, well, it keeps changing. So what's the impact of that? Or do we declare a final record at the end of the study, which could have an impact on oversight, right? Because you may only be doing oversight on final records. So I think that there are a lot of challenges around these living documents, but there are also opportunities because the living documents contain a lot of information that we can actually leverage to better manage risk. So I think in the future, what we would expect to see are maybe a more structured approach to this, similar to what we do in EDC, where instead of having like Excel trackers, maybe we have electronic forms where we're able to capture data directly, or integrate data from other sources so that we can better track these things. And so that's part of the trial master file, but it's in data format as part and parcel of the system itself. So having electronic forms rather than trackers, I think, would put us in a much better position.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you can interpret it easier. Its impact is broader. So I think, with that in mind, I know we have only a couple minutes left, and I really want to hear what you guys have to say about sort of the future of this. So Jackie, maybe we can start with you in thinking about, how does this continue to evolve? What is your crystal ball telling you in terms of, we've got these regulatory expectations, sort of advocating for risk-based approaches, but we think about, I think in particular advances in the capabilities of the system, but also things like predictive analytics or AI/ML. How do you see this shaping up? Like, what do you think is on the horizon for us?
Yeah, something that I know I would love to see, and I feel like we've been kind of tossing a lot of these terms around with AI and machine learning. Another one that really comes to mind is interoperability. I would love for our systems to communicate better so that, like I said, when we create or set up a site in CTMS, it's automatically pushing into the eTMF, setting that up, creating kind of expected content like, hey, you have a new site, we're looking for all these documents now. So to automate some of those links between systems, just to make it again, the system will flag us when it sees something that we need to address or look at, or potential areas where it's like, hey, this milestone's been achieved, but we don't see these records, or this monitoring visit has occurred, or being able to push content system to system, I think it would really improve and streamline just the way we approach some of these activities. Like I said, it would potentially remove some of that manual kind of tracking system to system and doing some of those cross checks. I think it would be great if the systems could facilitate some of that.
Yeah, I love that. I think maybe there's somebody on this call that's working on some of that stuff.
I had to throw out interoperability with Paul.
Sure Paul's
I'm sure there is.
Brian,
no, I mean, I think so. So absolutely agree with you, Jackie. That's key. I also think that standards are key.
Yeah.
Standardizing information, but not just in the TMF, across the board. And so there's some really exciting stuff happening. We're getting, for example, digital protocol, ICH M11 or C#. That for me is such an enormous step forward, because all of a sudden we have these documents that are very structured. They have a lot of very structured information about study designs and processes that we can start to leverage. And that information is being dispersed to all of the various different clinical systems. And then that, coupled with the standardization of the reference model as we're doing it today, so we're standardizing metadata, we're standardizing record types, we're getting more granular, we're starting to think more from a process-based standpoint. And then having USDM, so this is the Unified Study Definitions model, which, the ultimate goal is to allow interoperability, much easier interoperability between all these systems. All of that gives us a lot of very structured data in the future. And things like AI are very dependent on structured data to be able to learn, also unstructured, but there were, standards definitely help. And so I think that standards are going to help us not only build out better risk calculation or risk modeling tools, but it's also going to help us leverage AI to really power our risk-based approach. So I think the next sort of 5 years or so is going to be very exciting. With everything that's going on, it's really going to be a revolution.
Brian, curious to hear your thoughts.
I have no idea what the future holds with this. 15 years ago, when I got into this, I didn't have a flashlight. I didn't have very good reporting. I couldn't really see much as it pertains to from a high level view. Now I feel like I have a great flashlight, and I just know that wattage is going to be greater, and the simplification on the business is going to be more with all the automation. We've, partners, vendors, systems are inherently, you get AI. And so there's been so much movement over the past 5-10 years, and then to be the next 5 years, Paul has greater insight into that, but I'm very much looking forward to it. That much I can say.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it's almost like TMF is finally coming.
No, that's great. I mean, it is funny.
Sorry, David.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. No, I was just going to say, I think there's something really truthful in what you said, Brian, is that, you go back not even that long ago, I would say even 2 years ago, and some of the stuff that some people are doing now, we weren't even really thinking about, right? So it is changing really quickly right now. And I think, I was having a chat with somebody about this last week, is like, we sort of hit this point where, like, the process, the underlying process is, I think, much more well understood as to why we're doing these things, how clinical trials are run, having some technology to support them. But now leveraging these sort of new tools and new approaches starts to unlock ways of looking at that data in totally new ways, right? And people are wanting to interact with the TMF because it actually provides value much more than compliance. Right. And I think that's truly going to help with transformation. And people want to take, to your point, Paul, that approach to standards, because they're going to see the value. They're not just going to see, compliance guy told me I need to do it. It's going to be more about, like, actually, this is really valuable. Right.
Useful. Yeah.
So as the chair of this session, unfortunately, I'm going to have to start to shut it down. But this is a great conversation, and we could probably do with 2 hours to discuss this topic. But unfortunately, David, we are coming to the end, and I know that other people will have other meetings. So I do want to just say, give a few messages about tomorrow. So thank you very, very much to all of you for giving such amazing insights. And I think the fact that we have so many different things to think about when it comes to risk-based approach is definitely a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. So tomorrow is the last day of TMF Week 2025, sob. But we've still got a number of great sessions for you tomorrow. Tomorrow is all about TMF Oversight, and it's kicking off at 9 o'clock Eastern with 3 p.m. European time, 2 p.m. UK time, on a session regarding embedding quality in your TMF through QMS integration. So looking at the relationship between quality systems and your and quality assurance and your TMF. And there is definitely obviously a very strong link between those two things. So Donatella will be talking to us about that. So please do join that. And then, as I said, remember to go to the session at 12 o'clock as well to see if you won the Converse or the free pass to the CDISC conference. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much to all of our speakers and our panelists, rather. Great discussion. And thank you to Kim for organizing, as always, and I wish you all a great lunch or a great dinner, wherever you are, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Big thank you to you, Paul, for putting
Thanks,
this on.
everyone.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.